You've been invited to play in a role play game and you are not sure what they're talking about. They seem to have a vocabulary all their own. They speak of campaigns and they speak of encounters and they speak of engagement and enemies, and it's just all very confusing. Hi, I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG, and today we're going to be looking at the encounter. It is a singular portion of every adventuring system, every role-play game out there, and yet sometimes this term is considered mysterious or misunderstood because it gets misdefined and misused quite often. So today we're going to be looking into that. But before we get into that, if you like this channel and want to follow more information, click all the buttons down below. It makes makes YouTube know that you're part of the audience here, and you'll be able to get all of our videos. But before we do that, let's get started, shall we? Alrighty, now you notice one thing that's changed is I've actually got multiple cameras now, so I'm getting really sophisticated. Ooh. Now, granted, I'm still running this show as a one-man show, so forgive me if I drift back and forth. But today we're going to be talking about what is an encounter. There are a lot of words that get confused. A person who is a novice game master has already heard terms like campaign or game session or event, and all of these terms get confused. And I want to clarify that the idea of the encounter is a specific thing. It is not the entire game session. Yes, there may be several encounters in a game session, but those can be confusing at best and mind-numbing at worst. So we're going to be looking at not only the nuance of what an encounter is, but how to build one, how to properly use an encounter, and ultimately how it can make your game the envy of all of the other people around. And stay till the end, because there's a real secret to being a great game master at the end of this episode. Okay, so when you look at a role play game, pardon me, I've got a. When you're considering a role playing game, you're looking at a period of time assigned by the storyteller or director or whatever you want to call him as the time that we're going to do the processes that make up a role play game. And encounters are absolutely critical to the development of any RPG. I left the map appear in the background only to show that we've got a world of things that might happen in a game session, and it is optimally up to the director to kind of plot or plan or choose whichever encounters you will be engaged with in a session. And they are so broadly defined that I don't want to pigeonhole our conversation with any one particular one of them at this point. So let's get on to what an encounter might be. Okay, so an encounter. Narrowest definition, an encounter is a single or multi-stage segmentation or chunk of action in your game. For example, if the overall story is to go from the village to the castle and there engage the dragon, then you've got multiple stages of that process. And each of those is technically an encounter. It doesn't necessarily mean that the encounter has to be a particular set of actions. You know, there may not be any, for example, fighting at all in an encounter, or conversely, maybe all it is a fight scene. These are different perspectives on what an encounter might be. The reason why I mentioned multiple stages is that the action may transition during the scene from one type to another. So, for example, you may be in a situation where you start with a conversation and get pushed into a conflict by a nemesis or incidental bad guy or whatever, and so therefore now it's going to be multiple stages. And the as long as you are in the same scene with fundamentally the same personnel, then the continuation is made of that specific encounter. If you, on the other hand, first go to town, pick out your gear, and then travel towards your destination only to run into burglars or bandits, and then you have to have that engagement, that would be a separate encounter. And so each encounter is isolated to a singular location and generally the same cast. Furthermore, especially if you are dealing with a game master who has a story that they are laying out before you, these encounters will be featured scenes in a larger story. While there may be one or two engagements that occur en route that are really non-essential to the story, those, while broadly could be considered to be encounters, really fall beneath this framework. And the idea here would be that the elements of the story that are essential are fundamentally the encounters. And by featured scene, generally it's more than a one-off decision that needs to be made. It'll be a conversation. It'll be potentially a combat situation, potentially smooth talk or negotiation, manipulation, whatever. And so the element of that is not the entire campaign, but it is an encounter. And the reason to differentiate the terms is that it's awfully easy in a role-playing game to get lost in the mumbo jumbo, so to speak, get lost in the terminology and really miss out on some of the real insights that you can gain from a specific encounter. In other words, if you are on your way to face a dragon and you end up with an encounter with bandits, perhaps there is something that you need to gather from those bandits in terms of information. Maybe they have a secret bit of insight into how to engage with the dragon, or perhaps they know of a secret entrance. And therefore, the encounter doesn't necessarily only equate to an experience point advantage. It might actually relate to a gathering of additional information that you may not have been able to get to otherwise. So as a player, when you enter an encounter, you'll want to be looking at it from a larger sense of what it might be able to benefit you as a group and as an individual in that group. And because it is a featured part of the larger story, more than likely there will be information that will be useful to you in the game session that will allow you to perhaps perform better, gain information quicker, perhaps pick up some insight you might not have seen before, and so on. Now, these encounters can be anything from a combat scene to a discussion. It could be someone who simply needs to provide you with information that you wouldn't be able to continue the adventure otherwise. Perhaps it requires you to do some investigation. There are so many different ways that an encounter might go. Realize that they are not necessarily listed as go to this place, fight a monster, go to that place and fight a monster. Instead, it might be go to this place and gather information, get some insight on who the bad guys are. In the case of these brigands we mentioned, perhaps they have now given you a back entrance to the dragon's domain, and so you can get to them and gain yourself some advantages. All in all, the game master is generating his portion of the game in effect in advance to give you things to work with in the story as you play. And so therefore realize that the affording of an encounter is actually providing you with a new resource to gain something towards your agenda. So always keep your eyes out for how that might work. Realizing, therefore, that the encounter could be a dramatic scene or a fight scene or something other than those, realize that you need to perhaps be more adaptable in your approach. Perhaps you don't just necessarily approach the enemy with a weapon in your hand. Perhaps you instead are raising your hand in friendship. It's a matter of what you as a player want to do, but the game master is providing the encounter specifically for a purpose in the game. Now, in all candor, they could actually be providing the encounter as a form of a red herring, something to draw you away from the primary story. So realize that the purpose may not be fully a blessing. It may actually be something else. So make sure that you're aware of it. But coming to the table, knowing that your encounters are to be considered and thoughtfully engaged will provide you with a better play experience, because you won't necessarily approach the situation in a half-cocked or damaging way. Generally, therefore, the very nature of the specifics of the encounter are going to be critical to the story, or at least significant to its advancement. So I've mentioned it before, when you are playing a role-playing game, you will need or want to have a notebook or at least some loose leaf paper to take notes, because it may be possible that information will be provided in the encounter that will make the overall play of your session more effective and more enjoyable. Furthermore, it adds more depth if you have information that you can hold on to in the story as perhaps precious resource for later use. And it also helps to develop a core memory for what the persona actually knows in the story, which is, of course, absolutely essential in a long-term or long form session campaign. This information, if it's critical, the game master will pretty much by nature have to find a way to provide it to you. But assume that it is never critical to the story, but that it's going to be essential. And so therefore do what you can to provide the storyteller with the means to get the information to you. So if it appears to be a conversation that the person wants to have, entertain, at least in some part, having that conversation. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to accept everything at face value. And one of the biggest things to remember is that the game master or storyteller, even if he's stepping into the role of a non-engaged player and he's actually bringing information to you, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is on your side or that he's being particularly helpful. He could be, as I said, sowing a red herring into the mix. And so just be mindful that the engagement, the actual encounter itself, will have some kind of merit for the story. Which means that when the shooting is done, when the fighting is completed, don't consider that to be actually the end of the scene, because an encounter generally is intended to be something of merit to the adventurers in terms that they will value. So yes, giving you extra loot, or perhaps letting you find an item that will be needed. A great example is perhaps one of the people that you have just recently engaged with has a key that might be necessary where you're going. So consider prying for additional information and such until you feel confident that you've received and gathered what is going to be necessary for the later encounters in the session. Now, from the storyteller's standpoint, if you are creating an encounter for your players, you do want to take into account all the things that we've already mentioned as far as find something in that encounter that will be useful to the players, something that will provide them with new insight or new possibilities that they may not have considered. You even want to consider also what the players may do that is not in your wheelhouse. I can't tell you how many times when I've been a storyteller that the players have completely bamboozled me by choosing to do something that made, at least initially to me, no sense, or that seemed to alter the very story elements itself. And realize that it's that agency, what the players do, that really matters. And so try to work within the parameters you've set, but also be prepared to expand into areas that you haven't prepared for, because the players are going to do their best to resolve the encounter, whether it's a combat or whether it's drama, to their benefit. The other thing to realize, too, is that when we're talking about the encounters, while a part of the larger story, are themselves a story on their own right. And so when you are engaging with the players in an encounter, give gravitas to that. In other words, why are the brigands in particular on that road? Are they aware of the players and where they are going? If so, what is their purpose for supporting, in effect, the dragon by interfering with the players? Maybe instead their engagement is meant to test the players' mettle to see whether they are worthy of facing off against the monstrous dragon. Who knows? But the element that we really have to take into account is that the story element that is the encounter has to also have its own begin, middle, and end, and an outcome. And the beginning, middle, and end can be all in one stage. You could have multiple stages where, for example, they engage with the brigands, they break the morale of the brigands, and the brigands run away towards the dragon's lair, specifically for another encounter that you intend for them to meet up with before they face the dragon. I'm spitballing here, but the idea is that you need to be able to explain within the microcosm of that encounter precisely why it happened, how it came to be that way, and give the players not only the beginning and the middle, but more importantly, and this is where we're getting down to the actual secret for today. The secret to being a great storyteller is to make sure that your encounters are resolved before you move on, so that there's not a pileup of confusion leading into your major encounter, your major session defining scene. This really is a matter of deciding how are you going to determine what happens when the encounter is over. If the brigands broke and ran, is that the conclusion, that they got away? Or do the players need to pursue them to find some interesting additional clue, cue, encounter, etc.? And so realizing that the players need to have conclusion on this, the best thing I can remind you is that when you are getting to the conclusion of the encounter, the players are clearly going to defeat the monster, compete against the bad guy and win, gather as much information as they can, give a reason or a way for the conclusion to occur. If it's the case of gathering information, it's like, well, I'm sorry, I don't have any more time. I do have some other things I have to do. I'll talk to you later and disengage that way. but more importantly, make sure the players have reached their own conclusion within that, so there's no dangling loops on that encounter that are still hanging out there in the void. Hey, Echo is back. Glad to have you with us again. Or should I say Echo, Echo? Anyway, and I'm glad to have you with us. The challenge with ending the encounter is that you don't want to cut it off so that it seems final, nor do you want to leave it as a boiling pot to have to deal with later, because that may confuse the ending of your actual episode. You may have had other things that you wanted to accomplish. So find ways to close out the encounter before you move on. All right, so we've talked a little bit about what an encounter is. We've talked a little bit about how to make them compelling and close them out. But I want to take a minute and talk about how you actually weave the encounters into your story. And this is kind of a pro tip, because almost every game master writes their adventure for the evening and has an idea of what encounters the players are going to deal with and what fight scenes there are going to be and which conflicts are going to be non-combat. Realize that adding additional encounters becomes essential when your players have actually done their job appropriately and figured out how to get past your long form combat that you intended and broken it down into, bite-sized pieces and finished it off in record time. Being able to weave an encounter in by having extra encounters sitting in the queue, so to speak, provides you with a way to continue the play session after the obvious conclusion has been made, but also to perhaps add extra fuel to the engagement so that the storytellers are no longer the only ones telling the story. The players, with the way they've processed the adventure for that night and concluded it, maybe they've now given you a new idea you want to run with. So weaving a new encounter in is a good thing. Now, we haven't talked about how to end a session yet. I have in previous videos, but the idea of concluding Yep, I'm totally with you there. The mechanism of keeping the story going, the continuity of it, is kind of essential. Now, for those of you that prefer one-shot adventures, maybe 3 encounters total, adding new encounters aren't necessarily your choice or your preference. The reason why I mention it is that even if you are not intending to add the players into another story, by providing an ancillary encounter that leads them in a slightly different direction, you get the opportunity, therefore, to kind of preload the adventure towards what the players want to do. Yep, exactly. The process of weaving encounters really is more a matter of deciding where the story is going to go. And I know that the sandbox game masters will roll their eyes and challenge us slightly. But even in a condition where you are letting the players choose their course, giving them additional information from which to make decisions is actually a positive thing, because then the players are adding their own personal agency into the decision-making process of guiding the adventure. We really want to make sure that we provide, therefore, the players with the utmost in play experience, and also be able to conclude any businesses that have occurred, any businesses occurred in the campaign or in the story of that episode, encapsulate it so that when they move on, there's no hanging bits that cause confusion. I can tell you from 50 years of doing this that players will endeavor to find ways to draw on previous threads unless you've made it clear that those have been cut off and that it's a new element of the story. So just make sure that your encounters are themselves encapsulated as small stories within the larger, greater story. Okay, with that, I've completed what I wanted to talk about in reference to the encounter. Echo, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask them. I'm open now to have just a conversation outside of the parameters of this specific episode. Hope you had a great holiday, by the way. I'm very glad that they are over and we can get back to life as it is. that happens. They find a door and they go, oh, that must be the exit, so let's go out that door. And then if it's something that was essential to you as a storyteller, then you obviously have another trip for them to go back in. Of course, that ends up being an entire other episode, so that can make it even more fun. So if they choose to not engage or they find reasons to run away, then so be it. But aha, that's a clever one. So they missed the front half, so to speak. They came in through the middle. Yeah, I think I may have told this story before, but when I was a young game master, I might have been doing it for maybe 2 years. And I explained to the players that the adventure was going to be basically a dungeon maze that they'd have to get through, a labyrinth, if you will. And one of the players, well, first of all, the 3 players in the group at the time were all much older than I was. And so they determined, they asked me how thick were the walls of the enclosure of this labyrinth, and foolishly I gave them a number, and they go, oh, okay, we can accomplish that in about a half an hour. And so we will endeavor to bring our digging gear. 2 of them were dwarves and the other one was a half-orc, so they soon started making hay with my adventure by literally boring a straight line through the dungeon instead of paying attention to any of my side passages or any of that. Instead, they just started bashing through the walls. Granted, it was waking up all of the monsters, and so my monsters were all prepared, but only the ones that they decided to engage with by driving through the stories. So it was kind of a challenge in terms of deciding how we were going to handle the fact that they were running roughshod. Well, needless to say, after that, my adventures had steel walls and reinforcements, and that kind of thing wouldn't happen again. But it made it pretty crazy. So oh, good. I'm glad they made it through and were able to face off against the zombies and in that way, because cutting through half their number by finding a hole through the top makes perfect sense. So anyway, I am at the end of my material. Do you have anything else you would like to add, Echo? I'd be glad to engage with any of that. Let's see here. There you go. That sounds about right. Alrighty, well, I will be back tomorrow. It's Friday, right? Today's Thursday? Yes. So we'll be back tomorrow at 10 a.m. with another episode, and we will be running our live stream games on Friday and Sunday. If you want to be a part of that, feel free to join our Patreon program, and by doing so, you get to play as one of the characters in our games on Friday or Sunday. Alrighty, I will talk to you later and see you next week, everybody.